Hey guys, I'm Naya and welcome back to the channel. For today's video, I decided to talk about Tearlament counters because we did cover Splight counters, so it's only suitable. We're gonna cover a couple things and I decided to be a bit more organized because in the last video, I just sort of threw a lot of counters out there that I felt like might be interesting to consider. But right now I decided to split them into two categories. So we're going to be covering stuff that is already in our main or side decks because of the format we are in right now. And because of, I guess, the format we're assuming we're going to go into, which is Splight as well. So we're going to cover all of these cards. And then I also figured I would mention a couple that are a bit more specific into the Tearlament matchup in particular. So with that being said, please let me know if there's anything I'm missing, if you think some of these cards will have impact or if they're just not good enough. Any kind of thoughts you have, please let me know. And of course, if you like the video, like it, sub to the channel, check out all the social media, as well as the newly created Patreon if you want, of course. And yeah, with that being said, we can go ahead and get started. So the first couple cards we're going to be covering are going to be those aforementioned sort of regular, so staple cards, I should say. The first one is Ash. And I think Ash is quite impactful when we talk about the actual normal summon because Rhinoheart does do a lot. It's a very powerful starter, as well as some builds tend to play the Supreme Sea Mare, which is also really nice. And then if you look at a couple variants, so we have the punk stuff, we have the branded stuff, there's also inclusions of dangers, which is very smart, and we don't have Ishizu cards yet, so we're gonna look at only those builds that are sort of going to be the first one that Tearalaments are going to sort of evolve into. And if we look at the branded stuff in particular, Ash is still incredibly strong on Branded Fusion, and Branded Fusion grants a lot of plays for the Tearlament part of the deck as well. So if you're able to prevent that, I think that's very strong. And like I said, also the starter. And then looking at the punk version, because punks are incredibly strong together with this deck, I think. Foxy Tomb, for example, triggers Tearlaments since it's not part of cost, so that's very strong when it comes to Foxy Tomb, when it comes to Zeamin, as well as Emergency Teleport. You have a lot of cards that Ash can be used against, and since it is a very staple card, we should talk about a couple, points of interaction you have with Ash. And then the next cards are going to be Impermanence and Veiler, and I sort of want to split them a bit. You're gonna get what I mean in a second. But when it comes to Impermanence and Veiler, it's important to do it on the starter. But when we're talking about actual Impermanence as well as Chalice, Droplet, and Ruler, I think those cards are going to be very, very impactful, not just into the Tearlament matchup, but overall into the Splight matchup as well. So it makes sense to side them because they're strong against Tearlaments as well. You have Window, which can be made on turn 0, which is kind of insane. So if you're really worried about that, we just might use Forbidden Chalice to prevent that, and if you have Impermanence and you maybe don't use it on something, then you can still keep it and have it ready for whatever they might put up on the field. Because looking at different variants, you have the Mirror Jade that just might be on the field, you have Dragostapelia, you have a lot of cards that those kinds of cards like Impermanence, Chalice, Ruler, Droplet are going to be very impactful going second as well. So yeah, I think that's also important to note. And then the other, I guess, regular one would be Gamma, and I think Gamma is amazing moving forward, not only into the Splight matchup, but the Tearlaments as well, because you're able to hit graveyard effects. So like that alone, I think is almost makes it worth it. But Gamma is a bit weird because, as I tend to mention a lot, it's very much dependent on personal preference. So if someone wants to run it, I think you have a couple points of interaction, when it comes to the graveyard effects or the starters or anything that the player might put up. But yeah, Gamma is a bit costly sometimes when it comes to that brick, and because it's not always useful when you actually have cards on the board. So if you're thinking only about going second, I think it's incredibly strong. The next one is going to be DD Crow, and DD Crow is going to be amazing because the Tearlaments, they need to actually shuffle themselves back into the deck to be able to fusion summon together with themselves. So if you use DD Crow and you just prevent that summon altogether, I think that's very impactful. And we're gonna see that recurring pattern of just getting rid of the actual card in the graveyard and therefore preventing the fusion summon. But firstly, we need to cover a couple more staples. So we have Nibiru. And this one is kind of weird. I get that because they don't always summon a lot, but they can. So I wanted to cover Nibiru simply to say that right now we don't really know in which direction the deck is going to go. And if you're going by like branded stuff, for example, like Despia branded doesn't summon a lot. So if you take the Tearlament version of branded, they might not summon that much, but still, you know, it's sort of important to keep in mind that if a person is really unaware or plays into Nibiru because they just see a lot of broken cards in their opening hand and they just throw everything out on the board, then you can easily wipe them out using that Nibiru because they're not going to have exactly a negate. You know, they're just going to have a couple monsters when it comes to like Mirajade, Dragostapelia, their fusion, and they might even continue fusion summoning to get the Kitkalas into the graveyard to be able to mill 5 and then continue going if they trigger their effects. So Nibiru is kind of weird, but like I said, I wanted to mention it so you keep it in mind because maybe not everybody is going to play around it. And then the next one is going to be D-Barrier. So Barrier has been amazing for a couple months now, and I think moving forward is going to be really, really nice against this deck for obvious reasons. You know, you just fusion summon a lot. So I wanted to mention D-Barrier as well. And then moving on to actual cards that are a bit more specific to side into this matchup. The first one is D-Shifter, and I wanted to mention D-Shifter because Splight in the OCG actually started using it because Tearalaments became so oppressive and they became much more represented, and right now we have Flunder, which can easily run D-Shifter, and if we don't see any kind of ban list anytime soon, although even with a ban list, I don't really see Flunder getting hit. But I just wanted to say that if we don't see a ban list, the format is pretty much going to be almost the same. So taking that into account, Flunder, I think, can inherently counter Tearalaments just because they have D-Shifter. So if you have that kind of deck that can afford to run it, I think that's very, very powerful. The next one is Skullmeister, and I'm a big fan of Skullmeister. I think it's incredible when the format is right for it. And yeah, right now, like, you just negate that Tearlament in the graveyard, and I think you're going to do a lot with that. Like, they need to have an extender, which they might have, but still, you know, Skullmeister I think is going to be really, really nice moving forward. Then we have a couple trap cards, and when it comes to those, like, I'm not saying for every single card on this list that it's going to see play, simply because a lot of factors play into account when it comes to how many people actually play the deck, your personal meta that, you know, of the event you're going to, the deck you're running, but, you know, it's just a couple of examples. So I wanted to mention Soul Drain. I think the card is very, very powerful against Tearlament. And then another one is Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, which is also very specific, but very, very nice. So a couple of these cards can be used against almost a plethora of decks, and that's why I think it's important to point them out if you maybe want to run them. And the next one, also a bit more specific, is actually going to be Necro Valley. So if you prevent stuff from going out of the graveyard in any kind of way, I think you've done a lot. And I get that Necro Valley cannot be exactly used in every single deck. Like, realistically, you can play it in Gravekeeper and like Subterror. So I'm not saying it's going to be an amazing tech, but I just wanted to point it out. And then the next one is going to be, it's not exactly a tech, but I wanted to point out Abyss Dweller. And because there are a lot of different decks that can use rank 4s because they're just so generic. You have Salamangreat, you have actually Tearlament itself, like you are able to make those rank 4s. And I also get that the builds are very, very different, so you don't always have space. Maybe you have space like for 1xcs, which is always going to be Redoer, or I guess for the most part. But if your deck does have enough space to run Dweller, I think it's incredible to just shut them off immediately. And it's also a lingering effect, so it doesn't lose to something like Dark Ruler, you know, just stuff like that. And with Dweller, it's a bit weird because you need to take Gamma and Impermanence into account. But, you know, we're getting into the specifics. Like, you know what I mean? I think it shuts the deck off completely. So it's important to keep in mind if you're playing the kind of deck that can actually utilize it. Okay, then we have a couple one-ups. I wanted to mention D-Fissure and Macrocosmos. Like, they're just honorable mentions, I guess. They're at 1. You know, they're probably not going to be seeing any kind of play, but still, if you're playing that kind of deck that for some reason has space for those, I mean, I guess it's like I guess it's a nice tech. And then moving on, we have back row removal. And I wanted to mention it because sometimes we get to the point where against a certain deck, you need to side in like monster negates, stuff like Dark Ruler that's like just overwhelms the field. But then you sort of need to have back row removal as well, because if they activate Malanoids, and let's just say you're playing Splight, right? The trap card is going to hurt you a lot. So I wanted to mention back row removal specifically to sort of tie into the fact that it matters which deck you're playing. So if Tearalaments are going to hard counter you just because they're able to like set your stuff, I think it's important to note that you sort of like, you know, can get rid of that if you actually side in back row removal, which might be a bit specific, but I guess I still wanted to mention it, and also to mention Lightning Storm together with it, because you are able to actually choose. Let's just be honest, not every single person is going to put their stuff to defense mode. Like, it's just what we do. Not everybody is going to play around Lightning Storm, and sometimes you need to take those things into account. Like, if you're able to side Lightning Storm against a matchup and you know that you're going to sort of be successful with it because you can decide whether or not to hit back row or monsters in attack position, like, I guess it just really depends on the actual game you're in. But I still wanted to mention it. Although we need to take into account that Winda cannot be destroyed by card effects, so that's not an out, you know? Essentially, you're just outing like, I don't know, a Mirror Jade, a Dragostapelia, for example. You have a couple things. If you out the Mirror Jade, though, you need to think about its effect in the graveyard. So again, we're getting a bit too specific, but I still wanted to mention it because those cards are very, very stable. So they are going to be seeing play regardless. So it's important to note, like I said, you know, a couple points of interaction. The next group of cards are going to be Lava Golem, Sphere Mode, and Kaijus. I wanted to mention them because they are really, really good if your deck can afford to run them. And Tearlament, from what I've been seeing, like, they are going to be ending up on a couple monsters. So if you have that kind of deck, you can effectively, you know, use something like Lava Golem in. Also Sphere Mode, like, I think it's going to be quite interesting moving forward. Also into the Splight, like to side into the Splight matchup. And even if like Tearalaments are not always going to have exactly 3 bodies on board, you know, it's still something to sort of take into account if your deck can afford to run those cards. And the other one is also Pancratops. I think Pancratops is very, very nice moving forward, just because in itself, like, it can out Winda and another card, and just being that 1-for-1 trade-off is sometimes incredibly strong. So I guess it's also falling into the aforementioned category of just a couple going second cards which are very strong, you know, like Lava Golem, Kaijus, Pancratops itself. If you have the actual space, you know, I think it's a cool tech. And then to round things off, I wanted to mention Mystic Mine because from what I've been looking at, you know, when it comes to different builds, I've been building the deck in a lot of different ways, and I don't really see any specific outs for Mystic Mine, at least not exactly built in. Like, you have the counter trap card, but that's pretty much it. So then you need to take into account whether or not, like, if you're playing Snow, for example, you have a couple like cheesy plays with Snow and Mirror Jade if you're playing the branded version, but that's a lot of ifs. So if you're able to out Mystic Mine, then cool. But if you're not, you know, being the Tearlament player, I think Mystic Mine can really hurt you. And I get that it's very, like, you know, a card that people hate on. But it's important to mention because it is a strong going second card. You know, even first, if you're like using, what's it called? A Demise of the Land. Hate the card. But if you're using that, like, I think it's nice. I think it's something to take into account if you're going to be the Tearlament player. And then to actually round things off, because I remember there's something I still haven't mentioned, it's Silent Graveyard and also Foolish Return. Now, that's very specific, but I came up with this idea because I still think it's strong, especially in a deck that's like, for example, let's take Striker, right? If you're playing Striker and you play stuff that can be chained if you're going first, and so that your board doesn't get completely blown out by back row removal, which this has always been the case in those kinds of decks. And I think chainable stuff is very important. So when it comes to Silent Graveyard or even Foolish Return, like, I get Foolish Return is a bit more specific, but since it is seeing play because of Scythe, I wanted to mention it. I get that going second, it's not exactly like the strongest thing. They're going to get their effects off like in their turn, so it's not that strong, as well as Silent Graveyard. But if you are going first and if you're looking for a couple cards that are chainable, I think Silent Graveyard specifically is going to be very strong against the deck. So yeah, that would be like the last thing to mention. Hopefully I didn't miss anything. If I missed anything very obvious, like let me know. You know, I really wanted to come up with as many things as possible. So I guess in conclusion, there are going to be a couple things to counter the deck. I think the most important ones are going to be Ash, stuff that interacts with the graveyard, Gamma, things that just prevent their effects from going off. And I get that builds are going to be different. They are going to have extenders. So there's a lot of things to take into account, and we also need to tailor our side decks and main decks accordingly to Splight, because it is going to be another dominant deck. But as I keep mentioning, we don't have a ban list yet, so a lot of decks are still going to be very, very strong. And even looking at a deck that like uses Scythe Lock, that immediately hurts Tearlament. Like they cannot, what are they doing if they're not fusion summoning? You know what I mean? So it's like, you know, we have a couple things to sort of deal with them. And hopefully with this video, if I gave you any kind of ideas, you know, I'm very grateful, and please let me know. So yeah, if you like the video, of course, like it, sub to the channel, you know, check out all of the social media, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace!